This is Portchester Castle, or what's left of it, the walls. In Roman times, it was known as Portus Adurni, and for nearly 2,000 years, this place kept being reused, reshaped, and reimagined as a defensive site, a settlement, and a working system. And here's the key idea. It wasn't built to be an unbreakable fortress. It was built to make movement visible and to turn control into something routine. So, if you think of Portchester as a castle from one single era, you miss the point. This is a long story, layered over centuries. What I want to do is simple. I want to help you see how life worked here on the Solent coast in Hampshire at the northern edge of Portsmouth Harbour by combining archaeology with modern AI tools. That's why we're here. Portchester is extraordinary because it never stopped evolving. From Romans to Saxons, from Normans to medieval kings, and later even to prisoners of war in the Napoleonic era, each age left its own architectural fingerprints and its own reasons for keeping this place alive. Before we begin, let's clear something up. Portchester was not designed primarily as a siege castle. From the start, the goal was different. Control a harbour, watch the coastline, manage a gateway. And the location wasn't chosen by accident. To the south, deep water offered safe anchorage. The Isle of Wight acted like a natural shield, softening storms and discouraging sudden attacks from open sea. To the north, Portsdown Hill gave an advantage, a vantage point over roads leading inland. So the system here was never just stone walls. It used geography too to standardize one constant question. Who comes in, who goes out, and when? Portchester's Roman roots belong to a violent and unstable time. By the late 3rd century, the empire was shaken by internal conflict, pressure at the frontiers, and, critically, raids arriving by sea. In the Channel, attacks linked to Frankish and Saxon groups increased. Rome responded by strengthening coastal fortifications across southern and eastern Britain. Today, we call that defensive network the Saxon shore, Litus Saxonicum, a term that comes from late Roman administrative language. Sources like the Notitia Dignitatum, dating to the early 5th century, even mention a command structure under a count of the Saxon shore and the bases under his control. And what becomes clear is this. The Saxon shore wasn't one sudden project. It was a system that formed over time, starting in the late 3rd century as Rome tightened coastal security step by step until it became an organized mechanism of control. Within that context, Portus Adurni emerges as a key node. We don't know the name from a carved inscription. We recognize it from the Notitia Dignitatum list. That means absolute certainty is difficult, but among the candidates, Portchester is considered the strongest match. The main fortification phase is often dated to the late 280s AD, and that timing fits a larger story, the era of Carausius. Carausius was appointed under Maximian to deal with piracy in the Channel. He began as a naval commander, and within a few years he seized power in Britain and declared himself emperor, a classic usurper. How does someone become that ruthless? Honestly, it's hard to imagine. But from a strategic viewpoint, his rule demanded two things: fast reaction at sea and solid footholds on land. Harbour-locking forts like this one could watch and deter raids, while also protecting supply, shelter, and repair for a fleet. So it makes sense to picture Portus Adurni as a base that controlled the entrance of Portsmouth Harbour, a grip point, a place to hold on. And the mindset of this era wasn't build one wall and the threat ends. Sea power, fortifications, and administration had to work together. A single fort could never solve everything. What you really see is a chain: successive coastal forts, patrol routes, safe anchorages, and a wider system for surveillance and response. Empires shifted, Carausius fell, Electus rose, Rome took Britain back. But places like Portchester kept their value, because what could signal imperial control more clearly than a fortress that blends military force with logistics and turns the coastline itself into something manageable? One reason Portchester is so well preserved today comes down to Roman engineering. Smart materials, modular thinking, and a design built to last. The fort follows a near-square plan, typical of late Roman coastal forts, and that's not a coincidence. Roughly 200 meters across, enclosing around 36,000 square meters, it offered not only an imposing outline, but also a large interior space. Even now, parts of the wall rise to around 6 meters. At the base, the thickness reaches roughly 3 meters, creating the kind of mass that can absorb force. But the strength isn't only about size, it's about technique. Inside the wall is a core of flint and mortar. On the outer faces, flint is laid more neatly in courses, and at intervals, horizontal bands, limestone slabs or double rows of brick, cut across the structure. Those bands matter. They make the wall behave in layers, binding it together and resisting cracking. So at Portchester, survival isn't just about the stone itself, it's about how the stone was locked into a system. But what truly turns Portus Adurni into more than a perimeter wall is the rhythm of the design and the towers that break it. There are 20 D-shaped projecting towers around the circuit. Many still stand today, and that repeating pattern creates the best preserved impression the site is famous for. And tactically, the projection changes everything. Instead of one straight defensive line, the wall becomes a machine for angles. Even if an attacker reached the base, they wouldn't only face fire from the front, they could be hit from the side or from a diagonal line that erased blind spots. This isn't just high wall thinking, it's geometry, sightlines, arcs, and continuous coverage. The spacing between towers encourages regular patrol and observation, and the gates, positioned to force movement through specific points, link defense to traffic management. Some scholars suggest these towers could also support heavier weapons like ballistae. At Portchester, we shouldn't present that as absolute fact, but it's fair to say the design allows for that kind of power. Here, defense speaks not only through height, but through shape. The gates follow the same logic. To the west, the land gate. To the east, the water gate, opening directly toward Portsmouth Harbour. And on the north-south axis, two smaller secondary gates. The water gate is especially revealing. It shows this wasn't a closed inland outpost, it was a coastal infrastructure, a place designed to operate with supply, shipping, and sea access. Now, there's a common misunderstanding. People assume that, like the routine of Hadrian's Wall, the human story here must be mostly outside the walls. But excavations at Portchester challenge that idea sharply. One of the most striking findings is this: 27 infants were buried inside the walls, and that forces a conclusion. If babies were here, then the interior wasn't only military. A substantial civilian presence must have existed as well. This fits wider patterns in Roman Britain. Adult burials often appear in cemeteries outside settlements, while infant and newborn burials are frequently found within living areas, near houses, courtyards, or beneath floors, suggesting a different ritual category within the community. We can't point to a spot and say, this family lived exactly here. But when you gather the evidence, the picture becomes hard to deny. Because the interior wasn't defined only by guard schedules and storage discipline. Archaeology indicates timber buildings and workshops inside the walls. Around them, animal pens, latrines, waste pits, and refuse heaps. These are not traces of a temporary camp. They suggest continuous life. Tools were repaired, materials were worked, kitchen waste piled up, animals were kept. It starts to feel less like a fort and more like a small village living inside a military frame. So, Portchester wasn't a pure garrison. It functioned like a micro-settlement woven into the military core. Most days weren't filled with epic battles. They were filled with management, work, repair, production, supply, and the ordinary labor that keeps a system running. That's how it survives. Not only through dramatic moments, but through repeated tasks. Gates opening and closing, goods counted and distributed, structures patched, waste controlled. Portchester's routine wasn't just waiting, it was the daily machinery of empire made visible, especially on the coast. When Rome withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, Portchester didn't end, it changed. In the 5th century, Germanic Grubenhaus-style sunken huts appear inside. The area shows signs of cultivation and even a well. This detail is crucial. After Rome, there wasn't simply an empty gap. There was transformed use, a shifting continuity, not a collapse into silence. By the 10th century, the story intensifies again. Portchester becomes active within a security landscape shaped by Viking pressure. The Kingdom of Wessex responds not only by fighting, but by building a defensive geography. Fortified centers called burhs serve as refuge, garrison, and regional control points. Portchester's identification as a burh and its appearance in the Burgle Heidage list leaves documentary footprints of this transformation. In other words, the walls become part of a system linked to taxation, labor obligations, and watch duties, a working defensive unit integrated into daily life. And here's something worth noticing. In this period, what happens inside the walls speaks as loudly as the walls themselves. Excavation summaries, including those highlighted by English Heritage, disrupt the expectation of an empty courtyard and purely military structures. Evidence suggests successive Anglo-Saxon timber buildings within the enclosure. And by the 10th century, especially in the southwest quarter, a more planned and elite settlement pattern appears. A large hall, a courtyard arrangement connected to it, a stone tower, a cemetery nearby, and multiple smaller structures. That combination is not random. A great hall is not simple shelter. It's for gathering, hosting, decision-making, and status display. The stone tower may carry both symbolic and practical roles: watch and signaling, secure storage, local defense, or even a bell tower function depending on context. And the cemetery is a repeated reminder. This was never only a military position. It was a lived center, a place where people didn't only work and govern, but also buried their dead within a sacred landscape tied to identity. So even before the Normans, Portchester was more than a refuge. Its burh status suggests an administrative and military hub, a place where watches were organized, supplies stored, news gathered, authority displayed. The wall stays the same, but the life inside reorganizes itself again and again for each new threat. Then the Norman era arrives, and the scale of the Roman enclosure creates a new problem. To defend a perimeter this large, you would need an enormous garrison. So the strategy changes. Don't try to hold every meter of the ancient circuit. Strengthen a smaller, more defensible core. The Normans build an inner bailey in the northwest corner, and in the 12th century the keep rises. Portchester becomes both a defensive stronghold and a lordly residence. Its rise as a royal node takes shape in the Middle Ages. In 1154, when King Henry II takes the throne, the castle becomes royal property. It serves as a key base for campaigns in France, and also a prestigious residence. Under Edward II, fear of a French invasion drives expensive repairs. Then Richard II arrives, and in 1396 to 1399 he transforms the inner bailey into a luxurious palace. And one detail is especially striking. The palace windows do not look outward to the outer walls, they face inward toward the courtyard. That choice suggests privacy, or security, or both. There is grandeur here, but it turns inward. And then comes an irony. It's August 1399. Richard is deposed. He never truly enjoys the palace he created. By the mid-14th century, the castle adapts again, this time to military technology. Early gunpowder defenses appear, the Asherton Tower and keyhole-shaped gun ports. Same walls, new language. Even when stone stays fixed, history forces flexibility. And then, in the summer of 1415, Henry V gathers his army at Portchester. The road to Agincourt begins here. At the same time, the Southampton plot is uncovered, the conspirators are captured and executed, so Portchester is no longer only a protector, it becomes a stage for royal politics. Then comes one of the heaviest layers of all, the prisoner of war era. From 1665 to 1815, tied to a series of conflicts, thousands of prisoners are held here. At the peak, numbers approach 8,000. Two-story wooden barracks are built in the Outer Bailey. When capacity fails, floating prison ships, hulks, are used. Inside, a strange economy forms. Prisoners craft bone dominoes, miniature guillotines, and strawwork boxes, selling them at market. Counterfeiting spreads as well. The walls remain, but the function is completely transformed. This is no longer a coastal gateway. It becomes a human warehouse of imperial war, and one of the most striking, long-overlooked stories emerges here too. The arrival of black and mixed-race prisoners brought from the Caribbean. In 1796, after the fall of Fort Charlotte in St. Lucia, more than 2,000 black and mixed-race soldiers who had fought with the French and their families are brought to Portchester. Some had gained freedom after the abolition of slavery in 1794. For a long time, this history sat at the edge of the narrative. Today, modern heritage projects are beginning to place it where it belongs, in the center of the story. Then, an unexpected strategy appears. In 1810, French prisoners create a theater in the ground floor of the keep. They stage stories of colonial wars and the Haitian Revolution. And those performances also reflect the racist perspectives of the time. But the bigger point is this. Behind these walls, you don't find only discipline. You also find culture and survival tactics. If we can speak about Portchester with this level of detail today, we owe a great deal to archaeologist Barry Cunliffe. Across 18 excavation seasons, around 1/8 of the site was fully uncovered. More than 70,000 artifacts were found, and through them we can see Portchester not as a single military base, but as a settlement landscape that kept changing for roughly 1,500 years. So remember this, Portus Adurni is not a monument to one era, so why do we keep trying to squeeze it into just one? In truth, this place is stacked like layers, from the defensive network of a usurper emperor, to a Saxon Burh, to a Norman keep, to a royal palace, to a prisoner camp, and finally into modern memory and heritage. The walls are like a stage, but the order inside is never fixed. Power, fear, supply, management, routine, survival, and forgotten lives keep shifting places, then rebuilding themselves again. So why do we still go there today? Just to look at stone? Or to listen to a 2,000-year story of survival whispered by the walls? I think, at least a little, those stones do speak, and some of us can hear them.